Part 2, The Age of Distortion. Chapter 4, Kali Yuga and the Predicted Corruption of Wisdom. What Kali Yuga actually describes. There is a particular irony in discussing the distortion of spirituality through the language of Kali Yuga. Modern spirituality frequently speaks about transformation as though humanity were approaching some entirely new condition of existence. New Earth, ascension, higher dimensions, collective awakening, a shift in consciousness. Yet the Hindu tradition contains an ancient framework for understanding something quite different. The yugas describe vast cycles of cosmic and human development in which Dharma becomes progressively obscured. The movement is not necessarily from truth to complete falsehood. It is from clarity toward confusion, from discernment toward indiscrimination, from an integrated understanding of reality toward fragmented understanding, from living according to Dharma toward increasing identification with desire, conflict, status, possession, and appearance. This distinction matters. If Kali Yuga were simply an age in which truth disappeared, there would be little spiritual work left to do except wait for its return. But that is not the more useful interpretation. Truth remains. The difficulty is recognizing it. The lamp has not necessarily gone out. There is simply more smoke in the room. This provides a powerful framework for understanding the modern spiritual environment. The problem confronting the contemporary seeker is not a complete absence of wisdom. Quite the opposite. There is an extraordinary abundance of spiritual information. Ancient scriptures are available instantly. Meditation techniques can be learned within minutes. Mantras can be found online. Translations of the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Buddhist sutras, Taoist texts, mystical writings, tantric traditions, and contemplative literature are available to almost anyone with an internet connection. Teachers can speak to millions of people without ever meeting them. The modern seeker has access to more spiritual vocabulary than perhaps any previous generation. And yet, abundance does not necessarily produce discernment. It can produce the opposite. A person can possess thousands of spiritual concepts while having very little understanding of how those concepts fit together. This is one of the defining conditions of the spiritual age. The problem is no longer simply ignorance. It is information without architecture. The Hindu conception of cosmic decline. The concept of Kali Yuga belongs to the larger Hindu understanding of cyclical time. Rather than imagining history as a simple line moving permanently toward improvement, many Hindu traditions understand existence through cycles of manifestation, development, decline, dissolution, and renewal. The four yugas are traditionally described as Satya Yuga, the age of truth and relative fullness of Dharma; Treta Yuga, an age in which Dharma remains strong but begins to diminish; Dvapara Yuga, a further decline in the stability and expression of Dharma; Kali Yuga, the age in which Dharma is most obscured and confusion, conflict, attachment, and spiritual decline become increasingly prominent. The imagery is not merely about external civilization. It concerns the condition of consciousness. As Dharma becomes obscured, human beings increasingly lose the ability to distinguish what is essential from what is superficial. The problem is therefore not simply that people become less intelligent. A person may possess extraordinary intellectual ability and still lack viveka, the capacity to discriminate between reality and appearance, truth and distortion, essence and imitation. This is crucial. A technologically advanced society can still be spiritually confused. A highly educated person can still be governed by attachment. A person can know thousands of facts about consciousness while remaining largely unaware of their own motivations. Information and wisdom are not equivalent. Knowledge can accumulate while discernment declines. This is one of the paradoxes of Kali Yuga. The library becomes enormous. The ability to read it correctly becomes smaller. Nashat Dharma across the yugas. Dharma is difficult to reduce to a single English word. It can refer to order, duty, right conduct, intrinsic nature, responsibility, truth, and alignment with the larger order of existence. Within the Yuga framework, the decline of Dharma does not mean that Dharma ceases to exist. It becomes increasingly difficult to recognize and embody. This distinction mirrors something that happens repeatedly in human civilization. A teaching begins as a living understanding. It is expressed through practice. The practice becomes a tradition. The tradition develops language. The language becomes doctrine. The doctrine becomes identity. Eventually, people may defend the language while forgetting the transformation that gave birth to it. The form survives. The essence becomes increasingly obscured. This is why the concept of decline should not necessarily be understood as the disappearance of wisdom. Wisdom can remain present inside distorted structures. A scripture may still contain profound teaching, even when people use it to justify superiority. A meditation practice may still cultivate clarity, even when it is marketed as a lifestyle product. A mantra may remain sacred, even when separated from the discipline and philosophy surrounding it. A teaching may survive its own misuse. The existence of distortion does not prove that the original teaching was false. Sometimes it proves precisely the opposite. There is something valuable there worth distorting. Hack, declining discernment. The Sanskrit concept most relevant to this problem is viveka. Viveka is the capacity to discriminate, not discrimination in the modern social sense of treating people unequally, but the deeper philosophical ability to distinguish one thing from another, reality from appearance, permanent from impermanent, self from identification, knowledge from assumption, essential from unnecessary, liberation from attachment, tradition from interpretation, experience from explanation. This capacity becomes particularly important in an age of spiritual abundance. When there are only a few teachings available, the problem is primarily access. When thousands of teachings become available, the problem becomes discernment. A person can move from Hinduism to Buddhism to Taoism to manifestation to quantum spirituality to astrology to channeling to energy healing in the space of an afternoon. Every system may contain something meaningful, but meaningful fragments do not automatically form a coherent whole. A person can collect 10 truths and accidentally construct one falsehood. This is one of the central difficulties of modern spirituality. The seeker is surrounded by fragments. The fragments are often beautiful. Some are ancient, some are genuine, some are misunderstood, some are modern inventions, some are metaphors, some are literal claims. Some belong to entirely different philosophical systems, and without discernment, they can all be placed into the same conceptual container. The result may feel profound precisely because everything seems connected, but connection is not the same as coherence. Viveka and the loss of discernment. The loss of discernment does not necessarily look like stupidity. It can look like spiritual sophistication. A person may know the vocabulary of chakras, kundalini, karma, dimensions, vibration, consciousness, manifestation, shadow work, ascension, sacred geometry, non-duality, and quantum reality. They may speak fluently about all of them. Yet the more important question remains, can they distinguish what each concept actually means within the tradition from which it came? This is where the modern spiritual environment becomes vulnerable. The language of one tradition is combined with the metaphysics of another. A tantric concept is interpreted through modern psychology. A Buddhist concept is placed inside a manifestation framework. An Vedic statement is transformed into a claim about positive thinking. A yogic concept of prana becomes a universal explanation for every sensation. A traditional concept of liberation becomes an imagined transition into another dimension. The words remain. The framework changes, and when the framework changes, the meaning can change with it. This is not necessarily deliberate deception. Often, it is simply cultural transmission. Ideas travel, people reinterpret them. Languages change, cultures combine. New experiences generate new metaphors. But the result can still be distortion. The seeker therefore needs something more than openness. They need discernment. Hack, appearance, replacing essence. One of the most subtle forms of spiritual decline occurs when the external appearance of a teaching survives after its inner purpose has been forgotten. The symbol remains, the practice remains, the terminology remains, the aesthetic remains, but the transformation disappears. This can happen in several ways. Symbols, replacing understanding. A person may surround themselves with sacred symbols while never investigating what those symbols represent. The symbol becomes an ornament rather than a doorway. A mala becomes an accessory, a yantra becomes decoration, a statue becomes an aesthetic object, a mantra becomes a sound clip. The outer form survives, the inner discipline becomes optional. Yet the purpose of a sacred symbol was never simply to make an environment look spiritual. Symbols traditionally point beyond themselves. They are meant to participate in contemplation. They are reminders, maps, Supports for attention, means of orientation. When the symbol becomes the destination, the function is reversed. Replacing practice. Spiritual vocabulary can create the illusion of understanding. Someone can talk about surrender without surrendering, talk about compassion without becoming more compassionate, talk about non attachment while remaining deeply attached to recognition, talk about ego dissolution while constructing an elaborate identity around being egoless, talk about unity while dividing humanity into awakened and unawakened groups. The words can become substitutes for the work. This is especially easy in modern spirituality because spiritual language is often aesthetically attractive. It sounds profound. It can produce emotional recognition. It can create the feeling that something has been understood simply because it has been named. But naming a process is not the same as undergoing it. Experiences, replacing transformation. Another distortion occurs when unusual experiences become the measure of spiritual progress. Visions, synchronicities, energy sensations, kundalini phenomena, mystical states, psychedelic experiences, out of body experiences, profound meditation states. These experiences can be meaningful. Some may be genuinely transformative, but an experience is still an experience. The deeper question is what happens afterward? Does the person become less attached, more honest, more compassionate, more capable of tolerating uncertainty, more responsible, less reactive, less dependent upon recognition, more capable of living wisely? If not, the experience may remain an experience rather than becoming transformation. A person can have extraordinary spiritual experiences while remaining trapped in ordinary patterns of attachment. This distinction is fundamental. A change in experience is not automatically a change in character. The ancient traditions repeatedly placed importance upon integration because spiritual development was not simply about encountering extraordinary states. It was about what those encounters revealed and how that understanding was embodied. Hashed identity replacing wisdom. Perhaps the most important distortion is the replacement of wisdom with identity. The person begins by studying a teaching. Eventually, they identify with it. They are no longer simply practicing yoga, they are a yogi. They are no longer exploring Buddhism, they are Buddhist. They are no longer investigating consciousness, they are awakened. They are no longer exploring healing, they are a healer. The distinction may seem insignificant, it is not. Practice remains flexible, identity must be defended. Once a teaching becomes part of the self image, questioning the teaching can feel like questioning the person. This is where spiritual development can become trapped. The person begins protecting the identity that was originally supposed to help them become less identified. The tool becomes the attachment. The path becomes the personality. The map becomes the territory. And the spiritual seeker may become increasingly concerned with appearing to embody the path rather than actually walking it. This is one of the central mechanisms examined throughout this book. Commercialization. Modern spirituality also exists within an economic environment. This matters because markets reward certain forms of communication: attention, novelty, emotional stimulation, certainty, personal branding, accessibility, simple explanations, strong claims, constant content. These forces are not inherently evil. A teacher needs to communicate. A retreat center needs to pay its bills. A book needs to be sold. A practitioner may legitimately earn a living through their work. The issue begins when the economic structure starts shaping the teaching itself. What happens when complexity becomes commercially inconvenient? What happens when uncertainty does not sell? What happens when a nuanced teaching receives less attention than an absolute claim? What happens when transformation is packaged into a product? The marketplace naturally favors things that can be clearly presented, easily consumed, and repeatedly purchased. But genuine spiritual development is often slow. It requires repetition, silence, patience, discipline, failure, self-observation, correction. Years of practice may produce little that is visually impressive. There's not much algorithmic excitement in someone quietly becoming less reactive over 10 years. There is considerably more excitement in announcing that humanity has entered a new frequency. The market, therefore, has an inherent tendency to reward spiritual spectacle over spiritual maturation. Again, this does not mean every spiritual business is corrupt. It means the environment creates incentives, and incentives shape culture. Hash spirituality, becoming a commodity. Once spirituality enters the marketplace, almost anything can become a product. Meditation, mantras, initiations, crystals, courses, coaching, retreats, certifications, readings, energy sessions, spiritual memberships, exclusive communities, access to teachers, access to hidden knowledge. The problem is not that these things exist. The problem arises when consumption begins replacing practice. The seeker becomes permanently engaged in acquisition. Another book, another course, another retreat, another teacher, another technique, another initiation, another healing, another explanation. The spiritual marketplace can create an extraordinary paradox. The person may consume more spirituality while practicing less of it. They become knowledgeable about spiritual development without necessarily developing. The collection grows. The attachment remains. Tasher, attention as currency. The modern spiritual teacher operates within an attention economy. Attention is valuable. The more people watch, click, subscribe, share, and return, the greater the reach. This creates pressures that ancient teachers did not face in quite the same form. A nuanced teaching may require an hour. A dramatic claim requires 10 seconds. A complicated philosophical distinction may be difficult to communicate. A declaration that the awakened are entering a new dimension is immediately understandable. Algorithms do not necessarily reward truth, they reward engagement. And engagement is often strongest when people feel excited, threatened, validated, special, angry, hopeful, chosen, afraid, certain. This can create a strange spiritual environment in which the teachings most capable of stimulating emotion become the teachings most capable of spreading. The result is not necessarily deliberate manipulation. Sometimes the teacher simply learns what the audience responds to. The audience rewards certainty. The teacher provides more certainty. The algorithm rewards the teacher. The audience becomes more certain. A feedback loop develops, and spiritual culture gradually shifts toward whatever captures attention. Teachings shaped by market demand. A teaching that is difficult, demanding, or uncomfortable may struggle in a marketplace built around personal improvement. Consider the difference between you are perfect exactly as you are and your attachments, habits, desires, and assumptions require sustained examination. The first is immediately comforting. The second asks something from the listener. Similarly, you are a powerful creator and can manifest the life you desire is more commercially attractive than your desires themselves may require examination. The first reinforces the individual self. The second potentially questions it. And this distinction lies near the center of the light trap. A spirituality designed primarily to make the individual feel powerful, special, chosen, or validated can unintentionally reinforce the very identification that many contemplative traditions sought to loosen. The spiritual marketplace does not necessarily need to reject ancient wisdom. It can simply select the parts that are easiest to sell. Fragmentation. The modern spiritual seeker encounters teachings in fragments. A quote from the Bhagavad Gita, a Buddhist meditation technique, a Taoist phrase, a chakra chart, a manifestation exercise, a Jungian concept, a quantum metaphor, an indigenous ceremony, a hermetic principle, a Kundalini practice, a social media affirmation. Each may have a context, but the modern spiritual environment often removes that context. The fragment becomes portable. Portable ideas are easy to share, but portability has a cost. The surrounding philosophy disappears. The discipline disappears. The assumptions disappear. The limitations disappear. The purpose disappears. The fragment remains. This is why the modern spiritual landscape can contain enormous quantities of genuine wisdom while simultaneously producing enormous quantities of confusion. The problem is not necessarily false information, it is decontextualized information, isolated concepts. A traditional system rarely consists of one isolated idea. Karma exists within a larger philosophical framework. Dharma exists within a larger understanding of order and responsibility. Yoga exists within a broader path of discipline and liberation. Buddhist mindfulness exists within an ethical and philosophical path. Taoist non-forcing exists within an understanding of natural order. Tantric practices exist within specific metaphysical and ritual contexts. When one concept is extracted from the system, it can acquire a completely different function. Karma can become the universe punishing you. Dharma can become your dream career. Meditation can become stress reduction. Non-duality can become nothing matters. Manifestation can become think positively and reality must obey. Energy can become an explanation for every unexplained event. The original vocabulary remains. The original architecture does not. Mixing incompatible frameworks. There is nothing inherently wrong with comparative spirituality. Traditions can illuminate one another. A Buddhist can learn from Vedanta. A Hindu can appreciate Taoism. A Christian mystic can recognize similarities with Sufi contemplation. Cross-cultural dialogue can be profoundly fruitful. The difficulty begins when similarity is mistaken for equivalence. Different traditions may use similar words while meaning different things. They may describe similar experiences through entirely different metaphysical frameworks. They may pursue different goals. They may understand the self differently. They may understand liberation differently. They may understand reality differently. To place everything into one universal spiritual soup can erase precisely the distinctions that make each tradition intelligible. Comparison can deepen understanding, flattening can destroy it. This is why discernment is essential. Simplification. Modern culture naturally simplifies complex traditions. Sometimes simplification is useful, it makes difficult teachings accessible. But simplification can eventually become reduction. A sophisticated philosophy becomes a slogan. A discipline becomes a technique. A path becomes a personality type. A metaphysical system becomes a motivational quote. A lifetime of practice becomes a weekend workshop. The danger is not merely that something becomes shorter. The danger is that everything demanding is removed. What remains is the attractive surface. The difficult disciplines disappear. The uncomfortable teachings disappear. The obligations disappear. The contradictions disappear. The need for sustained transformation disappears. The result can be a spirituality that asks almost nothing from the person practicing it, and yet still tells them they are evolving. Distortion rather than disappearance. This is where the concept of Kali Yuga becomes particularly relevant. If the age is characterized by increasing distortion, then we should not expect wisdom to disappear completely. We should expect wisdom and distortion to coexist. A genuine teaching may exist inside a distorted interpretation. A profound teacher may operate inside a commercial environment. A traditional practice may be used by people who know very little about its original context. A person may encounter genuine truth through an imperfect system. Reality is rarely that tidy. This prevents the critique from becoming another form of spiritual tribalism. The answer is not modern spirituality is false, nor is it ancient spirituality was perfect. Both positions recreate the same binary thinking the book is examining. The more useful question is what is being preserved and what is being distorted? What remains? What has been added? What has been removed? What has been commercialized? What has been transformed into identity? What has been transformed into hierarchy? What has been transformed into fear? And most importantly, does the teaching still perform the function for which it originally existed? That is the test. Preserving the seed while losing the surrounding soil. Imagine a seed taken from a living ecosystem. The seed may remain genetically intact. It may still contain everything necessary for a tree, but place it on a shelf and it does not grow. The problem is not necessarily the seed. The environment has been removed. This is what can happen to spiritual teachings. A Sanskrit word survives. A mantra survives. A meditation technique survives. A symbol survives. A philosophical statement survives. But the ecosystem that gave the teaching its meaning has disappeared. The discipline surrounding it, the ethical framework, the teacher-student relationship, the stages of practice, the metaphysical assumptions, the cultural context, the purpose, the conditions under which it was traditionally used, the seed remains, the soil is gone. Modern spirituality often attempts to grow ancient seeds in entirely different soil. Sometimes they flourish, sometimes they produce something unexpected, sometimes they produce something beautiful, and sometimes the resulting plant resembles the original only superficially. This is not necessarily proof of malicious distortion. It is the natural consequence of transmission across time and culture, but it makes discernment indispensable. Why confusion itself was expected. If Kali Yuga is understood as an age, Dharma, and declining discernment, then confusion should not surprise us. The seeker may genuinely want truth and still become confused. They may sincerely seek liberation and still become attached to spiritual identity. They may sincerely want unity and still divide humanity into categories. They may sincerely want to transcend ego and still develop spiritual superiority. This is precisely why the challenge is subtle. Distortion does not always arrive wearing the appearance of darkness. Sometimes it arrives wearing the appearance of enlightenment. It speaks about love. It speaks about consciousness. It speaks about ascension. It speaks about unity. It speaks about light. The language can be beautiful. The intention can even be sincere. And yet the underlying mechanism can remain attachment. The person still needs to be special, still needs to be chosen, still needs an enemy, still needs certainty, still needs a hierarchy, still needs an identity. The vocabulary has changed. The structure has not. That is the deeper meaning of the light trap. The spiritual challenge of abundance. The modern seeker therefore faces a problem that ancient seekers rarely faced at the same scale. There is too much available, too many teachers, too many systems, too many interpretations, too many techniques, too many claims, too many revelations, too many competing cosmologies. The problem is no longer simply finding spiritual knowledge, it is learning how to distinguish knowledge from noise. This requires a different kind of discipline, not merely learning more, learning to discriminate, not merely collecting teachings, learning to recognize which teachings actually transform, not merely asking what resonates with me, but also what challenges my assumptions. Not merely does this feel true, but what is the evidence of its truth in lived experience? Not merely does this make me feel spiritually special, but does this make me less attached to being special? These questions move the seeker away from spiritual consumption and back towards spiritual development. Why more information does not necessarily produce more wisdom. The modern world has created a peculiar illusion. Because information is increasing, we assume understanding must also be increasing. But information can accumulate without integration. A person can read 100 books and remain confused. Another can practice one principle for 20 years and become profoundly wise. One can know the terminology of liberation. Another can simply become less attached. One can speak about compassion. Another can quietly behave compassionately. One can discuss non-duality. Another can stop creating unnecessary enemies. Which one has understood more? The question answers itself. Wisdom is not measured by the quantity of spiritual information possessed. It is measured by what that understanding does to the person. Does perception become clearer? Does conduct become wiser? Does attachment diminish? Does compassion increase? Does unnecessary conflict decrease? Does the person become more capable of living in accordance with reality? If not, information may remain merely information. The ancient traditions understood this distinction. The modern spiritual marketplace can easily forget it. The problem is not that wisdom has vanished. This is perhaps the most important conclusion of the chapter. Wisdom has not necessarily disappeared. It is everywhere, in scriptures, in contemplative traditions, in practices, in living teachers, in ordinary people, in silence, in nature, in experience, in suffering, in relationships, in the consequences of our own actions. The difficulty is that wisdom now competes with an enormous amount of interpretation. The modern seeker does not simply encounter the teaching, they encounter someone's interpretation of the teaching, then another person's interpretation of that interpretation, then a social media summary, then an influencer's version, then a commercialized course, then a personal experience interpreted through all of the above. Eventually, the original insight may be buried beneath layers of commentary. The challenge of the age is therefore not simply finding light. It is learning to recognize what is light and what is merely reflecting it. A mirror can shine. A polished surface can appear luminous. A screen can display an image of the sun, but none of these are the sun. Likewise, spiritual language can point toward wisdom without being wisdom itself. A teaching can describe liberation without liberating. A person can speak about consciousness without becoming conscious of their own attachments. A community can speak about unity while creating enemies. A movement can speak about love while demanding conformity. A teacher can speak about ego while cultivating personal worship. The appearance of light is not proof of illumination. This is why viveka becomes so important. The seeker must learn to distinguish. Perhaps then, the spiritual task of Kali Yuga is not simply to recover everything that has been lost. It is to learn how to see through distortion, to recognize essence beneath appearance, to distinguish teaching from interpretation, practice from performance, experience from explanation, wisdom from information, transformation from identity, liberation from escape, discernment from judgment, humility from spiritual superiority, and spirituality from the performance of spirituality. This changes the task completely. The seeker does not need to believe everything, nor reject everything. They need to discern. They can enter a tradition without becoming trapped by its identity. They can learn from a teacher without surrendering their capacity to question. They can encounter a profound experience without immediately deciding what it means. They can appreciate ancient wisdom without romanticizing the past. They can recognize modern distortion without declaring all modern spirituality worthless. They can remain open without becoming gullible. They can remain skeptical without becoming closed. This is the middle path between credulity and cynicism. It is the cultivation of viveka. And perhaps that is exactly what an age of distortion demands. Not more spiritual information, not more spiritual identities, not another hierarchy, not another group of awakened people standing apart from everyone else, but the ability to look at the enormous spiritual landscape before us and ask a deceptively simple question: what is actually here? What is the teaching? What is the interpretation? What is the attachment? What is the distortion? What remains when the unnecessary layers are removed? Central insight. If Kali Yuga describes increasing distortion rather than the disappearance of truth, then the modern spiritual marketplace becomes particularly significant. The problem is not that wisdom has vanished. The problem is that it has become harder to recognize. And perhaps this is the first great discipline of the age, not learning how to find more light, but learning how to distinguish the light from everything that merely appears to shine.